The Second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux took place during the Battle of the Lys, 24–27 April 1918, when an assault was launched against the Allied lines to the east of Amiens. It is notable for the first major use of tanks by the Germans, who deployed 14 of the 20 A7 versus, and for the first tank versus tank battle in history. The tank battle occurred when a group of 3 advancing A7 versus met and engaged 3 British Mark IV tanks, 2 of which were female tanks armed only with machine guns. The 2 Mark IV females were damaged and forced to withdraw, but the male tank, armed with 6-pounder guns, hit and disabled the lead A7V, which was then abandoned by its crew. The Mark IV continued to fire on the 2 remaining German A7 versus, which withdrew. The male then advanced with the support of Whippet light tanks which had arrived, until disabled by artillery fire and abandoned by the crew. The German and British crews recovered the vehicles later in the day. A counter-attack by 2 Australian and 1 British brigade during the night of the 24th of April partly surrounded Villers-Bretonneux, and on the 25th of April the town was recaptured. Australian, British and French troops restored the original front line by the 27th of April. Prelude. In late 1917 and early 1918, the end of the fighting on the Eastern Front allowed the Germans to transfer large numbers of men and equipment to the West. Buoyed by this but concerned that the entry of the United States into the war would negate the numerical advantage if they did not attack quickly, and that mass tank attacks like that at Cambrai in November 1917 made far more areas on the Western Front vulnerable to attack. The German commander, Erich Ludendorff, chose to use the temporary numerical advantage to punch through the front line and then advance north towards the sea. In March, the Germans launched the Spring Offensive against the Third Army and the Fifth Army on the Somme, which were under strength due to the small numbers of replacements being sent from Britain. In unfinished defenses, the Fifth Army was forced back quickly after the first 2 days. The Germans advanced under a heavy bombardment of high explosives and gas. The Germans advanced steadily west. The Third Army also fell back on its southern flank and the railhead at Amiens was threatened with capture. Paris was bombarded by long-range guns. The Allies moved reinforcements to the Somme front, and by the end of May, the German advance of the 1918 Battle of the Somme had been halted in front of Hamel. In preparation for a further attack, German railway construction companies were brought up and work undertaken to repair damaged railways in the captured ground. In early April, the Germans renewed their efforts, simultaneously beginning the Battle of the Lys in Flanders. The Germans managed to advance towards Villers-Bretonneux, a town on the high ground to the south of the Somme River. The terrain allowed artillery observers to see bombardments on Amiens, which was only 16 kilometers away, which was of great tactical value. On the 4th of April, the Germans attempted to capture the town with 15 divisions but were repulsed by troops from the British 1st Cavalry Division and Australian 9th Brigade during the First Battle of Villers-Bretonneux. After the first battle, the forces that had secured the town were relieved, and by late April the area around Villers-Bretonneux was largely held by the 8th Division. Although it had been one of the best British divisions, it had suffered badly in the German attacks of March, losing 250 officers and about 4,700 men, reducing its infantry by half. Replacements in the latest draft from Britain included 18-year-olds with little training. Battle. German Second Army attack. On 17–18 April, the Germans bombarded the area behind Villers-Bretonneux with mustard gas, causing 1,000 Australian casualties. On the evening of 23–24 April, an artillery barrage was fired, using mustard gas and high explosive rounds. Next morning, the Germans attacked the village with 4 divisions. The German infantry, with 14 supporting tanks, broke through the 8th Division, making a 3-mile-wide gap in the Allied line. Villers-Bretonneux fell to the Germans and the railway junction of Amiens became vulnerable to capture. After the Germans took Villers-Bretonneux, the first engagement between opposing tanks took place. 3 British Mark IV tanks from No. 1 Section, A Company, 1st Battalion, Tank Corps had been dispatched to the Cachy switch line. At the first reports of German advance and were to hold it against the Germans. One was a male, armed with 2 6-pounder guns and machine guns, under the command of Lieutenant Frank Mitchell. It was crewed by only 4 of the normal crew of 8, as the others had been gassed. The other tanks were females, armed with .303 in machine guns, for use against infantry. All were advancing when they encountered a German A7V, Nix, of Abteilung 3 Imperial German Tank Force, commanded by 2nd Lieutenant Wilhelm Biltz. Nix fired on the 2 females, damaging them to the extent that it left holes in the hull, leaving the crew exposed. Both retreated. The machine guns were unable to penetrate the armor on the German tank. Mitchell's male Mark IV continued to fire at the A7V, while on the move to avoid German artillery fire and the gun of the German tank. The movement meant Mitchell's gunner had difficulty in aiming the 6-pounders. The tanks fired at each other on the move, until the Mark IV stopped to allow the gunner a clear shot and the gunner scored 3 hits. Nix heeled over on its side, possible as a result of crossing an incline at the wrong angle. The surviving German crew, including Biltz, alighted from the vehicle and the British fired at them as they fled on foot, killing 9. The British tank was next faced by 2 more A7 versus. Supported by infantry, Mitchell's tank fired several ranging shots at the German tanks and they retreated. Mitchell's tank continued to attack the German infantry, firing case shot. 7 of the new British Whippet medium tanks arrived, attacked the Germans, encountered some battalions forming up in the open, and killed many infantry with the machine guns and by running them down. Mitchell later remarked that when they returned their tracks were covered with blood. Only 4 of the 7 Whippets came back, the rest were destroyed by artillery and 5 crew were killed. Being the last tank on the field and slow-moving, the Mark IV became a target for German artillery and Mitchell ordered the tank back, maneuvering to try to avoid the shells, but a mortar round disabled the tracks. A crew left the tank, escaping to a British-held trench, much to the surprise of the troops in it. Lieutenant Biltz and his crew boarded Nix and withdrew. The tank was eventually broken up for spares in June 1918. Earlier in the day, another tank in the same group as Biltz, A7V No. 506 Mephisto, had fallen onto its side and been abandoned. The tank was recovered by Australian and British troops some 3 months later. 4th Army counter-attack. About noon, the 1st Battalion of the Sherwood Foresters had attempted a counter-attack. The British 25th Brigade was considered for an attack, but this was cancelled. A tank with troops from the 2nd Royal Berkshire made a spontaneous attack from the north, pushing the German line back about 150 yards. General Henry Rawlinson had responded even before he received orders from Marshal Ferdinand Foch to recapture the town. At 9:30 a.m., he ordered an immediate counter-attack by the Australian 13th Brigade under General Thomas William Glasgow and the 15th Brigade under General H.E. Pompey, Elliot, both in reserve, though the 13th Brigade had suffered many casualties at Urnham Court nearby. Rawlinson intended an enveloping attack, the 15th Brigade attacking north of the town and the 13th Brigade attacking to the south. British troops would support and the 2nd Battalion, Northamptonshire Regiment and the 22nd Durham Light Infantry would follow through in the gap between the Australians and mop up the town. Once it was isolated, artillery support was available, but since German positions were unknown and to avoid alerting the Germans, there was no preparatory barrage to soften up the German positions. Instead, the artillery would bombard the town for the hour once the attack began and then move its line of fire back beyond the line held by the Allies before the German attack. The attack took place on the night of 25 April, after a postponement from 8:00 p.m. Glasgow argued that it would still be light with terrible consequences for his men and that the operation should start at 10:00 p.m. and 0 hour was eventually set for 10:00 p.m. The operation began with German machine-gun crews causing many Australian casualties. A number of charges against machine-gun posts helped the Australian advance. In particular, Lieutenant Clifford Sadlier of the 51st Battalion was awarded the Victoria Cross after attacking with hand grenades. The two brigades swept around Villers-Bretonneux and the Germans retreated for a while, escaping the pocket along a railway cutting. The Australians eventually captured the German positions and pushed the German line back, leaving the German troops in Villers-Bretonneux surrounded. The British units attacked frontally and suffered many casualties. By the 25th of April, the town had been recaptured and handed back to the villages. The battle was a great success for the Australian troops, who had defeated the German attempt to capture Amiens and recaptured Villers-Bretonneux while outnumbered. The village remained in Allied hands to the end of the war. Aftermath analysis. Fighting continued in Villers-Bretonneux and the vicinity for months after the counterattack. The Australians spent Anzac Day clearing Germans out of the houses and fighting in the streets, and the town was not secured until the 27th of April. On the 26th of April, a French-Moroccan division attack on Hangard Wood, south of the village, was a costly failure. On the 3rd of May, the Australian 12th Brigade attacked towards Monument Wood, east of Villers-Bretonneux. The attack failed, with the 48th Australian Battalion losing over 150 men to the Jaeger. The German offensive in the Australian sector ended in late April, as the Germans turned their attention to the French sectors. In May and June, a lull occurred on the Somme, during which the Australians exploited the success at Villers-Bretonneux, conducting a series of peaceful penetration operations that slowly advanced the front east. As the German offensive came to a halt around the Marne in early July, more fighting took place around Villers-Bretonneux, as part of diversionary moves by Australian forces acting in support of the Battle of Hamel. Corporal Walter Brown, of the 20th Australian Battalion, received the Victoria Cross for his actions. Later in the month, the area around Villers-Bretonneux saw more fighting when the 25th Battalion and 26th Battalion of the 7th Australian Brigade attacked around Monument Wood for his actions during the assault and German counterattack. Lieutenant Albert Borella of the 26th Battalion later received the Victoria Cross. After the Anzac Day counterattack, British and French commanders lavished praise upon the Australian soldiers who took part. Brigadier General George Grogan, a witness, later wrote that it was perhaps the greatest individual feat of the war for troops to attack at night, across unfamiliar ground at short notice and with no artillery preparation. These factors had proved essential to the Australian success. Fox spoke of their astonishing valiance, and General Sir Henry Rawlinson attributed the safety of Amiens to the determination, tenacity and valor of the Australian Corps. After the battle, the worst examples of looting by AIF soldiers of the war occurred. In 2011, King wrote that one culprit was Barney Hines, the "souvenir king" of the AIF, who was something of a celebrity. According to King, Hines raided a number of houses, looting alcohol and expensive clothes, which he then used to throw a party for his friends that ended abruptly when the Germans shelled the house, wounding Hines and several others. King also wrote that the Australians shared rations with French civilians in the town. Due to the coincidence of the day in which the counter-attack occurred, the battle holds a significant place in Australian military history. Nevertheless, it was a combined Allied effort. Casualties. The fighting around Villers-Bretonneux in April resulted in the following Allied casualties. The Australian brigades had taken 2,473 casualties. British casualties were 9,529 and French losses were c. 3,500. German losses were 8,000–10,400 men. Memorial. In the 1930s, an impressively towering memorial was established at the top of the Villers-Bretonneux military cemetery to honor the Australian soldiers who fell in France in the Great War. The cemetery is located between Villers-Bretonneux and Fort Eloy on the hill from which the famous night attack was launched. Some 10 miles east of Amiens and north of the Roman road to St. Quentin, it rises gently to a plateau overlooking Amiens, the Somme Valley and the town. The cemetery contains 2,000 graves, of which 779 are Australian. A further 10 Australian casualties of the battle are buried in the Villers-Bretonneux Communal Cemetery. The smaller Crucifix Corner British Military Cemetery just east of the town, in the shadow of a motorway embankment, contains the graves of Australian, British and French Metropolitan and colonial troops, the former including many Australians who fell in the area in fighting, which moved further to the east only on 8 August 1918. The victory gained at Villers-Bretonneux on the 3rd anniversary of the Gallipoli landings is yearly commemorated by Australians. In 2008, to mark the 90th anniversary, the Australian and New Zealand Anzac Day dawn service was held for the first time on the Fort Eloy Hill, as well as the traditional one held on the Gallipoli Peninsula.